Okay. So I know most of you in the room, who one way or another, and for those who I don't know, my name is Bruce Kogan. I'm a lawyer, but for the last long time, almost 30 years, I've been a law professor, and for about 25 years, I've done mediating in a variety of contexts. And a lot of my time these days is spent directing the Roger Williams Law School Mediation Clinic. So the law school trains in either basic mediation skills or in a separate family and divorce mediation skills class about 100 students a year in mediation. Obviously, we're quite committed to the role of alternative dispute resolution going forward in the court system and in the legal profession. And then each semester, I select 10 students to work with me, and I have an assistant who is not a lawyer, but who is a very skilled mediator. And the two of us supervise law students who mediate cases, most of which come from the Rhode Island Family Court, but we also do some small claims and landlord-tenant mediating. I do some of the cases myself, but my goal in the program is to really step the students up to the point that the students are the ones who are providing the service to the couples or the parties who are in conflict. So that's caused me to think a lot about how it is that somebody who completes a 30-hour, I think Deborah just completed 36-hour or 34-hour or 40-hour, 30-hour, 40-hour basic mediation skills, makes a transition from somebody who's been exposed to the praxis through formal training to becoming somebody who becomes comfortable working with parties in conflict and actually being capable of helping them. Jay, would you mind close the door? And I did a lot of thinking about this 6 years ago when we started the clinic, and I have tried to keep thinking about it because part of the training and part of what we expect from the students is reflective practice. That they think about what they're doing, that they reflect on it, and they learn from what they have just done. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, about what's the best way to move students along so that they can get to be self-reliant and comfortable as professionals doing this very important work. And that caused me to sort of do some reading about mentoring and how the mentoring systems work and try to create. And basically the program I run, although it's a service delivery program and an educational experience for students, because they get a lot of credit and they spend a lot of time working in the clinic, they're in court 3 days a week. Over the course of 14 weeks, they'll probably be at the table mediating in 30 or more cases. So that's a lot of mediating in a relatively short period of time. So when we laid out the training agenda for the year this year, we felt like we should emphasize the whole idea of bridging the gap. How new mediators become comfortable mediating, how experienced mediators become even more comfortable at what they do. And one of the topics that came up was the idea of mentoring. The board is, or the organization has different categories of membership. One of the categories of membership is the advanced mediator status. And the advanced mediator status entails a commitment on the part of those who have done a lot of mediating before, and who become, or at least seek to be recognized as advanced mediators, that they will in fact work with newer people, that they will basically provide mentoring. So we're trying to figure out how to get the organization to be more competent at mentoring, and this was in part the reason that we did this workshop. So all of us have heard about mentoring, and probably we have had mentors as we've moved through different phases of our lives, both personally and professionally. I certainly know that there are some people that I've worked with in different settings who I regard as my own personal mentors. And so, we know mentoring is where you form a connection between a more experienced individual in a particular area of work or a particular area of endeavor. In this instance, it's the profession of mediating. You pair up somebody who has more experience with somebody who has less experience in order to have that person with less experience have the ability to become more competent, to be guided, to maybe help that younger, newer person avoid missteps. I looked up found some quotes, in here about, what mentoring is. So, my thought about this is to sort of break down the idea of mentoring into 5 sort of phases. First phase would be, well, why do we do it? What's it about? That's kind of the first phase, in the first couple of pages. The second phase is, well, what's expected? What are the expectations of the mentor and the mentee? That's sort of the second phase. The third phase is, how do you formalize that relationship? Because I think it does require commitment on both sides. So formalizing the arrangement, putting the arrangement in place, requires care and requires sort of thought. So that I think is the third area. Then you have, once it's up and running, how are you communicating, how are you interacting, when you're both busy, when you're both doing different things and the mentor may not be at the table watching or observing or in the room observing what the newer mediator is doing. So there's the communication phase once it's up. And I believe very strongly, not just because I live on academic years and academic semesters, that when you enter into one of these partnerships, that there ought to be a fixed duration. There ought to be an end point to it, at which point the two of you can assess what you got out of it, and that there ought to be closure. So that's kind of the fifth phase, is the closure phase. So just in terms of starting with, the idea of, well, why do we do it and what's mentoring about, that's kind of the page 4. I'm pretty sure everybody in the room has been through some kind of mediation training, or if not everybody, the majority of you have been through a formal 40-hour, 30-hour training. And what we tell our students, what I tell my students, what Ruthie tells her students, one of my co-teachers that I work with a lot, Ruthie Rosenberg, we tell our students, this is necessary, but you're not a mediator. Just because you walk out with a certificate that says you completed a 40-hour course, you're not yet, it might, maybe in some states like Rhode Island, there is not a lot of formal regulation. There aren't a lot of prerequisites for what it takes to be a mediator. In Rhode Island, we have a confidentiality statute that says 30 hours of training. And mediator privilege attaches to you sitting with parties in the room. That's not a lot of training. So I think it's necessary, but certainly not sufficient for you to feel like you can be comfortable working with parties who have real problems when the work that you do with them can affect their lives. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for you to help them improve their situation. There's a lot of weight on your shoulders when you're a mediator. Training is incredibly necessary, but not sufficient. That something else needs to happen. And I hear that from people who take the training, which is, so we did all those simulation exercises, including a big one at the end, and somebody was sitting in the room and giving us feedback. I did it with Cheryl, Andy, Linda, and all of them feel like this is not enough. And could I get something more? Could I get somebody to help me make that move? And so that's what it's about. It's about, it's about providing guidance. It's about helping somebody not misstep as they go forward. It's about having some feedback in what you do. So if we had, if every one of you had the opportunity to enroll in my clinic, you'd spend 14 weeks, a very intensive mentoring system. But you can still find somebody, and that's what the association is pretty committed to, is to help newer mediators find somebody they can form these relationships with, so that you can get feedback on what you're doing, so that you can get connected to people who are actively engaged in mediating, maybe through an association like this, but maybe by having one special person who's going to be willing to work with you. That's why the mentee looks for this relationship. So then you have to say, well, why does the mentor do it? And given the amount of time that a mentor might, if it's really going to work, it does take time. Given the amount of time that a mentor should be willing to commit, then you have to think about why do it? Why on the mentor side could you or should you think about doing it? And there I think I get a lot, I personally, because I'm a teacher, get a lot of satisfaction out of working with students, working with newer individuals to the legal profession, newer individuals to the mediating world. I find it very rewarding. I also find it forces me, in talking to students, mentees, about the cases they're working on, it forces me to think about, well, how would I have done that? And then obviously I don't want to be telling them, well, you did it wrong, you should have done it this way. But I want to be thinking about that situation for myself and then helping them figure out, well, how might I have done that differently? So like a mediator, lots of times my interaction with my mentees is asking questions. We ask lots of questions as mediators, and I ask lots of questions when I work with my student mentees. But in terms of why I think it's a good idea, even for the more experienced person to do it, is you're improving the profession. Is one reason to do it. You're contributing to improving the quality of work that we're doing in this community. By helping people learn something from what you've done. And there are a number of ways that you do that. You do that by hopefully allowing them to observe you work. Maybe co-mediating with them, and then maybe by watching them on their own work for a while. And then serving as that sounding board that they can bounce things off of and get some feedback, from you as you go along. I do think, and I think this is like page 5, is before one, as an experienced person, thinking about, should I take somebody under my wing, you should ask yourself some questions. You should ask yourself, what kind of work have I done? What kind of work is this new person looking to do? Do I have the right experience? For example, if somebody came to me and said, I'm looking for somebody to do mediate personal injury cases. I've never mediated a personal injury case, ever. I never did personal injury legal work. That was not my experience base as a lawyer. It's not my experience base as a mediator. I would probably say, no, maybe there's somebody else that we ought to try to get you hooked up with. That I do think I have to be clear about what it is that I can help somebody with. What can I offer somebody? What are my strengths and weaknesses and abilities as a mediator, and how can I help make that work for somebody else? I want to suggest that if you're here because, like Jeremy or Frank, people who, or even Nancy, people who are very experienced mediators, if you're here because you're a very experienced mediator, then, you have to think about, well, what do I want that relationship to look like? What's my role going to be? What's that other person? You have to give some preparation to it before you even think about the willingness to say, maybe. I think you need to be honest with yourself about what can I bring to the table, what am I looking for out of this relationship as a mentor. And as a mentee, I think you have to be clear about what you're expecting from the other person. So I think that because it is a commitment that you're going to make to each other for some fixed period of time, that you need to be pretty aware of what your expectation is from the other person and what your expectation is from yourself. And so I've kind of broken that down into, I have a page here on what is the mentee looking for. So maybe that's something to talk about before responsibilities of each. But What the newer person is looking for is somebody who's going to be patient with them, somebody who's going to be supportive, but yet be candid and honest and willing to give them good, meaningful feedback. Even if you're not in the room, you can still give feedback, and I'll talk about how I do that, because I generally am not in the room with my students for a lot of good reasons. I think I need to be out of the room for the student to have command over and control over the process. That if I was in the room as a general practice, parties are going to wonder, well, why is the 67-year-old guy in the corner? He's the boss, you're the kid. So I feel like I need not to be in the room, but I want to be able to give feedback even when I'm not in the room, and I think I have some suggestions about how you could do that. I think you have to be somebody who is willing to be approachable, because it's not easy to ask for help. It's not easy to ask somebody to give you feedback, take time out of their day. So you need to be somebody who's going to be committed to it, who's going to be approachable, who is going to be honest with the mentee. And probably the last point I think is the most, maybe one of the most important, which is to recognize that the way you mediate doesn't necessarily have to be the way somebody else mediates. What I talk about in my training is there is an outline, there is a praxis, there is a process, and most mediators are trained the same way. Most mediators are trained about how you control the process and how you do an opening, explaining the process, and how you then ask each of the parties to talk, in a way that they're sharing what's important to them, and then you summarize that, and then you try to get more information, and then you build an agenda, then you pick a topic, and then you work on solutions, and then you work on the agreement. Most mediators are trained the same way. But I work the way I work. It fits within my skin. And the way I mediate might not be exactly the way Cheryl would mediate. Or Margie, my assistant, would mediate. So I have to, as a mentor, recognize it has to work for that person. It doesn't have to exactly replicate what I would do. I have to be willing to accept that they could also do it their way. They might have their reasons for doing it their way. I might want to talk with them about why is it that what decision points you made. When you intervened a certain way, what were you thinking about? Why did you do that? Do you think it worked for you? Did it not work for you? But I have to be willing as a mentor to not just be a coach saying, like a football coach nowadays calling them in through radios to the quarterback, 28 left, west, 1. I can't be doing that. I have to, be approachable, be willing to share what I know, but also be willing to accept that they might do it a little bit differently. So I do think it makes some sense to look at sort of responsibilities, that each one would have some responsibilities overall if the mentoring relationship is going to work. The mentee, has to be able to think through, what do I want to get out of this? And update that. Maybe what they thought they wanted to get out of the relationship might change over time. So they need to be reflective, not just about their mediating work, but reflective about their mentoring work. The mentoring relationship. They have to be not so thin-skinned. They have to be willing to at least accept that whatever constructive feedback they're getting is coming for the right reasons, and not necessarily do exactly what the mentor suggests, but at least be willing to think about it. They have to be open-minded about constructive feedback coming from a mentor. I feel it's real important, and this is what I see as difficult sometimes from my students, is they have to be willing to stretch, take on new challenges. I know my students, after a while, can do child support guidelines worksheets in their sleep. Mary, you know how to do those. So, I know they can do child support modification. Somebody's claiming, I lost my job, I shouldn't have to pay the same, and the other person's saying the kid still needs sneakers. So after a while, child support, getting the parties to work to an agreement about child support is easy. I need them to step up. I need them to be willing when I say, I think you're ready to take on something more. I think you're ready to take on, a change of placement dispute. That's a lot harder. So they have to be willing to be able to step up, because people reach comfort levels, and sometimes it's not everybody is so easy to stretch and bump up their comfort level. So they have to be willing to, to at least when the mentor makes that suggestion, they have to be willing to think about it. There's a lot on the mentee. They have to be willing to work at this and work at it seriously. And they have to be willing to share their thoughts and concerns as well. So on the mentor side, you probably more so than the mentee need to think about the structure of the relationship, because the mentee doesn't really know what the relationship between the two of you should look like. So I do think more of the responsibility about how is the mentoring plan going to be set up is probably on the mentor, which is why I have some materials in here that might help you think about that. You have to be willing to take time. I think that's the biggest thing, is take time. Take time to provide the feedback, take time to be committed to an open communication stream. Be willing to tell somebody when they do something well, and let them know you think they're doing it well, and be willing to tell them when you think they might want to think about doing it differently, to provide them with some critique of what they're doing. Commitment of time, I say regular time to meet with the person. I think part of what you do is talk about how do they move forward, sort of the career thinking, the networking. You have to be willing to help them network, take them to events. I encourage my students, although they don't always do it, to come to Mediator Association activities. I get them involved with, in the family in a court group. There's a professional group. I try to get them involved with that as well. I try to help them make those connections that are going to encourage their ability to grow. So that's kind of the expectations piece.